The first time Effie Crawford heard the thunder rolling across the Kansas plains in the spring of 1882, she thought it was God himself telling her she had made a terrible mistake coming out here. She stood on the sagging porch of the Heller boarding house in the small town of Caldwell, watching the sky turn the color of a bruise, her single leather traveling trunk sitting behind her, and her whole life compressed into everything she could carry. She had come from St. Louis with a letter of introduction to a Mr. Gerald Foss, a widower farmer who had placed an advertisement in the Missouri Dispatch seeking a woman of good character and domestic ability to share his homestead. Effie Crawford was 23 years old, the daughter of a bankrupt dry goods merchant, possessed of good character and excellent domestic ability, and absolutely no other options that she could see clearly in front of her. Gerald Foss had met her at the stage stop 3 weeks ago. He had been a thin man with watery eyes and a disposition that reminded her of old vinegar, and within the first hour she had understood that the letter he wrote and the man who wrote it were two entirely different creatures. His farm was 12 miles southeast of Caldwell, a collection of weather-beaten structures that listed in the Kansas wind like old men tired of standing. He had shown her around with the proprietary air of a man showing off livestock he intended to purchase, and something cold and certain had settled in her chest. She had lasted 18 days. She had left before sunrise on the 19th morning, taking only what was hers and walking the 12 miles back to Caldwell on roads that had been dry and manageable when she arrived. She had paid Mrs. Heller $3.50 for a week's lodging, and was now trying to figure out what in the wide and indifferent world came next. The stage back east did not run until Thursday. It was currently Monday. And the sky, as she stood there contemplating her situation with all the forced composure she could manage, was doing something she had never seen a sky do before. It was not simply darkening. It was lowering, pressing down toward the earth like a hand pressing down on a table, and the quality of the air had changed from the ordinary spring humidity of the day into something electric and alive and deeply unsettling. Mrs. Heller came out onto the porch beside her, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and the capable hands of someone who had spent 4 decades solving problems. "You should come inside, Miss Crawford," she said, not unkindly. "Is it a tornado?" Effie asked, because she had heard about tornadoes in the way that people who have never seen one hear about them, with a kind of abstract respect for something legendary and distant. "No," Mrs. Heller said. "Worse for traveling in some ways. That is a flood rain. You see how flat this country is. When it rains like that, there is nowhere for the water to go but sideways. The creek beds fill up and then the whole prairie fills up behind them. Everything between here and the Chicaskia River will be under 2 feet of water by morning." She paused. "Did you have anywhere you were planning to go this week, Miss Crawford?" "Not until Thursday," Effie said quietly. "Then you have nothing to worry about," Mrs. Heller said. "Come inside and have some supper." Effie came inside. She had supper. She slept in the small room with the window that faced east, listening to the rain begin, a sound like 1,000 hands drumming on the roof all at once, and she thought about the fact that she had no money beyond what it would cost to get back to St. Louis, and that St. Louis held nothing for her but the empty rooms of a house her father had lost to debt, and the careful pity of people who had once called themselves her friends. She was still awake at midnight when the rain hit its full fury. She had never heard anything like it. It was not rainfall in the way she understood rainfall. It was a biblical event, water falling in curtains and sheets, lightning splitting the sky every few minutes with cracks of white light that illuminated the town outside her window in stark, trembling detail. She could see, even in the darkness between lightning strikes, that the street below was running with water, dark rivers of it pouring down between the buildings and out across the flat Kansas earth. She did not sleep again until nearly dawn. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was washed clean and pale blue and innocent-looking, as if it had never in its life produced anything more dramatic than a mild spring shower. But the water remained. Caldwell itself sat on slightly higher ground, which was why the town existed at all in this particular location, and so the streets were passable, the mud deep and thick but not impassable. But beyond the edges of town, the prairie had become something else entirely. It had become a shallow inland sea, brown and slow-moving, stretching in every direction under the newborn morning light. Effie stood at the window with her cup of coffee and looked at it and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Kansas, a flutter of something that was almost wonder. She was not supposed to leave the boarding house. Mrs. Heller had made that very clear at breakfast, with the specific firmness of a woman who has seen what foolishness looks like on the Kansas plains. The roads were impassable. The stage would not run. There was nothing to do but wait, which was something Effie Crawford had never been particularly good at. By mid-morning, she had finished the book she had brought with her. By noon, she had helped Mrs. Heller with the laundry that had piled up during the storm, wringing sheets through the old hand-press wringer until her arms ached pleasantly. By mid-afternoon, she was restless in a way that felt almost physical, a kind of energy that had no outlet, pacing between the four walls of the sitting room while Mrs. Heller dozed in her rocking chair. She told herself she would only go to the edge of town, just to see, just to look at the flooded prairie from a closer vantage and then come back. She put on her sturdiest boots, the ones with the thick soles that she had bought specifically for coming out west, and she put on her practical gray walking dress, and she went outside. The edge of town was a revelation. The world had been remade overnight. Where there had been roads and fence lines and the distant dark line of willow trees along Bluff Creek, there was now water, everywhere, flat and brown and deceptively calm-looking, reflecting the afternoon sky like a tilted mirror. It was beautiful in a way that frightened her a little, the way beautiful things sometimes did. She walked along the higher edge, following a faint trail that skirted the worst of the flooding, and she told herself she would turn back at the old Miller property line, which she could identify by the remains of a split-rail fence that poked above the water line in a staggered row. She did not turn back at the Miller property line. The trail curved south and then dipped, and she followed it because it was still mostly dry, and because the day was warm and the sky was extraordinary, and she had been cooped up in a small room for too many days, and she was Effie Crawford, who had always, despite her best attempts at sensible behavior, pushed further than she strictly ought to. She did not realize how far she had gone until she turned around and could not see the town anymore. That was when the ground beneath her boots, which had been firm enough to walk on a moment before, simply was not. It happened that fast. One step onto what appeared to be solid earth, and her right foot plunged through the thin crust of dried mud, and into cold, knee-deep water. She lurched forward trying to catch her balance, and her left foot went in as well, and suddenly she was standing in the middle of what was apparently a submerged hollow that the raised trail had curved around without her noticing, and the water was deeper than she had thought, rising almost to her thighs now as she stood there, and the ground beneath it was mud, soft and sucking and greedy, pulling at her boots with every tentative step she tried. She was not in immediate danger of drowning. She understood that much. But she was stuck, genuinely stuck, the mud holding her boots with a grip that felt almost intentional, and the water was cold enough to make her breath come short. And she was a mile and a half or more from town on a flooded prairie where no one knew she had gone, having made a point of not telling Mrs. Heller because she had known Mrs. Heller would tell her not to. She stood there for a moment and assessed her situation with the clear, clinical honesty that she had developed over 23 years of getting herself into and out of difficulties. It was not good. She tried again to pull her right foot free, and the mud held it. She tried to lean forward and push through, and the ground under her front foot gave way and she sank another inch, the water now lapping at her waist. The mud was the problem, thick river-bottom mud deposited by the floodwaters across the hollow, and every movement she made seemed to settle her deeper into it. She drew a breath and called out loudly, in the direction of the town she could no longer see. Nobody answered. She waited a reasonable interval and called out again. The prairie absorbed her voice the way it absorbed everything, indifferently and completely, the flat land offering no cliff or wall or hillside to reflect sound back to her. The wind carried her voice south and west, and that was the end of it. She was going to have to stay calm. She was going to have to think. She was thinking, quite hard actually, working through the various possibilities with the methodical determination of someone who refuses to dissolve into panic even when panic would be the easier choice, when she heard it. A sound that was not wind and not water and not the distant cry of some prairie bird. A sound that was hooves on wet earth, moving at a canter, coming from the north. She turned as best she could without sinking further, craning her neck, and there he was. He came over a slight rise in the land that she had not been able to see from her lower vantage. A man on a dark bay horse, moving at a confident, purposeful pace across the flooded ground, as if flooded ground were simply ground with different properties, nothing to be alarmed about. The horse was a big animal, 16 hands at least, picking its feet up high with the careful deliberateness of an animal that trusted its rider's judgment, even while it clearly had opinions about the current state of the terrain. The man on its back wore a wide-brimmed hat the color of weathered cedar, a dark canvas duster that was dark with moisture halfway up the sleeves, and boots that had seen considerable hard use. He was not old, but he was not young either, somewhere in the good solid middle of his 20s, she thought, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and shoulders that suggested he had been doing physical work since before he was old enough to have much say in the matter. He saw her at approximately the same moment she saw him, and he pulled up his horse on the edge of the hollow and looked at her with an expression that she could not quite read at that distance, something between surprise and a very measured assessment. "Ma'am," he said. His voice carried easily across the water and the wind. It was a good voice, steady and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned a long time ago that raising it rarely accomplished anything useful. "I appear to be stuck," Effie said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise and because she had always preferred honest statements of fact to performances of composure she did not entirely feel. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You do." He sat on his horse for a moment, and she had the strange sense that he was working through his own assessment of the situation with the same methodical clarity she had been applying to it, calculating angles and depths and the nature of the mud and the weight of two people against the suction of the hollow. Then he dismounted smoothly, tied the horse's reins to the remains of a fence post that was still above the water line, and began to move toward her. He did not rush. He moved carefully, testing the ground with each step, reading the water with his eyes before he committed his weight, and she realized he knew this kind of terrain in the specific and detailed way that comes from having spent years learning it. He found the firmer ground along the edge of the hollow and worked his way around toward her from the south side, where the water was shallower and the mud less deep, moving with a quiet, considered efficiency that was somehow more reassuring than haste would have been. He reached the edge of where the mud turned treacherous and stopped, close enough now that she could see his face clearly. He was younger than she had thought from a distance, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark eyes under the brim of his hat and the kind of weathered skin that comes from years of outdoor work, and there was something in his expression that was direct and serious without being unkind. "If you try to pull straight up, the suction will just hold you harder," he said. "You need to rock your weight forward and then back, gentle, to break the seal. Can you do that?" "I can try," she said. She tried. She rocked her weight forward as he had said, feeling the mud resist and then, slightly, give a fraction and then back, and something in the seal loosened, not completely but enough. "Good," he said. "Keep doing that. I'm going to come in." He stepped into the water without ceremony, the cold reaching his knees immediately, and moved toward her with the same careful, ground-reading deliberateness, and she kept rocking as he had told her, and she could feel the mud beginning to relinquish its grip, slowly and grudgingly, one boot at a time. He reached her when her right foot was about halfway free. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting against the prairie sun, and the particular set of his jaw that spoke of someone accustomed to just getting on with things regardless of the inconvenience. He did not ask permission. He simply looked at her with a brief, questioning look, the kind that asks, "Are you all right with this?" And she gave him the briefest nod, the kind that says, "Yes, proceed," and he bent slightly and scooped her up. He did it the way she imagined he did everything, without making a production of it, without grunting or staggering, just a clean, efficient motion that lifted her clear of the mud's grip with a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle. And then he was straightening up with her in his arms, her right arm instinctively going around his shoulders for balance. And he was already moving, stepping back the way he had come with the same careful, ground-reading deliberateness, carrying her as if she were not particularly heavy or particularly complicated, just a thing that needed to be moved from one place to another. She was aware of many things simultaneously. The cold of her soaked skirt against her legs, the warmth of his arms, astonishing by contrast, solid and certain as the frame of a house, the way the muscles of his shoulders shifted under her arm as he moved, the smell of him, horse and leather and rain, and something underneath all of that was simply human and specific, and not unpleasant in the slightest. The fact that she was being carried across a flooded Kansas prairie by a complete stranger and had not yet learned his name. He got her to the edge of the hollow, to firmer ground, and she expected him to set her down there. He did not set her down there. He assessed the terrain between them and the higher, drier ground near the fence line where his horse stood waiting, and he kept going, kept carrying her, stepping around the worst of the mud and through the shallower water with the systematic patience of someone completing a task that is not finished until it is properly finished. She said after a while, because the silence seemed to want filling, "This is very kind of you." "It's all right," he said. It was clearly not a brush-off, just a statement. He was concentrating on his footing. "I should not have come out this far," she said. "No," he agreed simply, without judgment, just the plain agreement of someone who deals in facts. He carried her for what she later calculated must have been the better part of 3 miles, from where she had gotten stuck in the hollow all the way back to the edge of Caldwell, picking the route with the deliberateness of someone reading a map that only he could see, finding the higher ground and the firmer crossings, navigating around the deep water with a confidence that made her feel, for the first time since she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell 3 weeks ago, genuinely safe. His horse followed them at a loose walk, reins drooping, with the philosophical acceptance of a well-trained animal that has been through stranger situations than this. When the ground finally rose enough to be reliably solid, when she could see the rooflines of Caldwell clearly ahead of them and feel the earth beneath them as earth rather than as the thin crust over cold water, he stopped and set her down. He did it carefully, making sure her feet found firm purchase before he released her, and she stood there on solid ground feeling the weight of her soaked clothing and the ache in her legs and the strange residual warmth of having been carried. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, meaning it with her whole chest. "I don't know what I would have done." "You would have figured something out," he said, and she thought he actually believed that, thought he was not simply being polite. She looked at him standing there in the afternoon light, his duster dark with water to the thigh, his boots almost certainly ruined, his horse blowing quietly behind him, and she thought, "I do not know this man's name." And that seemed suddenly like an omission that needed correcting. "My name is Effie Crawford," she said. "I'm staying at Mrs. Heller's boarding house." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely decode, something that shifted in his dark eyes like the shift of light on moving water. Then he nodded once, a small careful nod, as if receiving something he intended to keep. "Tobias McCrae," he said. "Tobias McCrae." She turned the name over in her mind as she turned her eyes toward town, and it settled in her like something that had found the right place. He walked her back to Mrs. Heller's, leading his horse, and he did not say much during that walk, and neither did she, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have just shared something real and are taking their time deciding what to do with it. Mrs. Heller opened the front door before they had even reached the porch steps, with the expression of a woman who has been worried sick and has converted that worry into a formidable readiness to express herself. "Effie Crawford," she said, "you are soaked through to your bones, and I have been worried half to." She stopped, taking in Tobias standing behind Effie with his horse. "McCrae," she said, in a different tone entirely. "Is she all right?" "She's fine, Mrs. Heller," Tobias said. "Got stuck in the hollow past the Miller line. She want a hot bath and dry clothes." Mrs. Heller's expression shifted from alarm to something more complicated and then to the brisk practicality that was her default setting. "Come inside, child," she said to Effie. "McCrae, you'll want to dry out yourself. I'll put coffee on." "I appreciate it," Tobias said. So he came inside, and Mrs. Heller put coffee on, and Effie went upstairs to change into dry clothes. And by the time she came back down, her hair was loose and damp around her face, and she felt scraped clean by the afternoon's events, scoured down to something simpler and more honest. Tobias was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, his duster hung on the peg by the door, and without it he was less imposing and somehow more real. He wore a plain dark shirt and canvas trousers, and he had taken off his hat, and his dark hair was pressed flat from wearing it. He did not look romantic in any dramatic sense. He looked like a man who had done a day's work and was drinking coffee and existing in the world without making a great performance of it. He looked up when she came in, and there was that thing again, that shift in his expression, something that moved and then settled. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Considerably," she said, and sat down across from him and accepted the coffee Mrs. Heller put in front of her. Mrs. Heller, to her credit, found a great number of things that needed doing in other parts of the house. "Do you live near Caldwell?" Effie asked, because she wanted to know and because asking felt better than the alternative, which was sitting in silence and trying not to notice the specific quality of his attention. "My outfit is about 8 miles north," he said. "I work the Harlan Range." "We were moving cattle down toward Caldwell before the rain hit, and I got separated from the others trying to keep a steer from swimming itself to death in Bluff Creek." He paused. "The steer was fine, ornery but fine. And you were riding back when you found me," she said. "Yes," he said. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Mr. McCrae, you carried me 3 miles across flooded prairie. That is not a small thing." "You asked me not to call you Miss Crawford," he said, and then seemed to register that she had not actually said that yet, and a slight, brief color came into the skin along his jaw. "I mean, I expect you'd prefer not to be formal about it, given the circumstances." "I would prefer exactly that," she said, and something in her chest turned over quietly like a page. His name was Tobias McCrae, and he was 26 years old, and he had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 19, with $40 and a good horse, and the determination to build something of his own on the frontier. He had worked for the Harlan Ranch for 4 years, saved what he could, and was 2 years from having enough to put a deposit on his own quarter section under the Homestead Act. He told her these things over the course of the next hour, not in a rush or with any apparent design, just answering her questions with the direct honesty of someone who has nothing to hide and no particular interest in constructing a flattering version of himself. She told him about St. Louis and her father's dry goods business and its collapse, and about the advertisement in the Missouri Dispatch and Gerald Foss and the 18 days she had lasted before walking 12 miles back to Caldwell in the dark. 12 miles, he said, before sunrise. It was actually quite nice, she said. The stars were very clear. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that shifting, settling look that seemed to happen when she said something that surprised him. "I expect they were," he said. He left before supper because he had cattle to get back to and men who would be wondering where he had gone, and he shook her hand at the door with the same directness he applied to everything, a firm, brief grip, and he looked at her for a moment in the doorway light before he put his hat back on. "I'll be in Caldwell Thursday," he said, "if you're still here." "The stage runs Thursday," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." He left that hanging there in the air between them. Not quite a question, not quite anything definite, just a statement of fact with a lot of space around it. Then he mounted his horse and rode north, and she watched him go until the prairie swallowed him up, and then she stood in the doorway a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was still here Thursday. She had told herself, lying awake on Tuesday night, that this was purely a practical decision. The mud on the roads was still thick and treacherous, and the stage might be delayed anyway. She had told herself, lying awake on Wednesday night, that she had nowhere urgent to be in St. Louis, and that a few more days in Kansas was not a significant expenditure of her remaining funds. She had told herself these things with the determined rationality of someone who is trying very hard not to admit to something simpler and more frightening. On Thursday morning, she helped Mrs. Heller make breakfast and did not go to the stage stop. Tobias McCrae arrived in Caldwell at 10:30 in the morning, driving a wagon this time rather than riding, with a list of supplies the Harlan Ranch needed, and the particular alert quality of a man who is paying attention to something beyond his immediate errand. He came to Mrs. Heller's at noon, which was when he knew meals were served because Mrs. Heller kept a regular schedule that the whole town knew, and Effie was setting the table when he knocked. She answered the door and they looked at each other, and both of them, she thought, understood at the same moment that Thursday had not been an accident for either of them. "Miss Crawford," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, careful and deliberate, as if the name were something he had been practicing. "Mr. McCrae," she said, "would you like to come in for the noon meal?" He came in for the noon meal. He came in for the noon meal Thursday and the following Tuesday and the Thursday after that. And gradually the visits extended beyond meals, into the long prairie afternoons when the light turned amber and the wind came down from the north carrying the smell of grass and distance, and they would sit on Mrs. Heller's porch or walk along the higher edge of town where the flooded land had dried back to something more recognizable, and they talked. They talked about everything. She had not expected that. She had expected a man of his background and occupation to be taciturn in the specific way of men who spend more time with cattle than with people. And he was quiet, genuinely quiet, a man who did not fill silence for the sake of filling it. But he was not taciturn with her. He talked about Tennessee and the particular green of the hills there, and how the flatness of Kansas had taken him years to stop finding oppressive and start finding beautiful. He talked about cattle and the mathematics of range work, the constant calculation of water and grass and weather. He talked about the book he had read over the winter, a battered copy of David Copperfield he had traded 3 days' work to acquire, and she had read the same book in better circumstances, and they compared opinions with the lively disagreement of two people who both care about the subject. She talked about St. Louis, which she missed in some ways and did not miss in others, the concerts and the libraries and the general assumption of civilization on one hand, the suffocating smallness of being a woman with no money in a world designed to notice only women with money on the other. She talked about her father, whom she had loved despite his failures, and about her mother, who had died when Effie was 14, and whose voice she was beginning to lose the memory of, which frightened her in a quiet, persistent way. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, full and serious, and without the reflexive reassurances that people sometimes offered when they were uncomfortable with what they were hearing. He just listened, and sometimes he asked a question that showed he had heard all of it, and she found that she trusted him in a way that had accumulated gradually, like water filling a vessel, until she was surprised one afternoon to realize that the vessel was quite full. She had extended her stay at Mrs. Heller's twice now, and her funds were not inexhaustible, and the practical question of what she was actually doing in Caldwell, Kansas, was becoming difficult to avoid. She thought about it on a Friday afternoon in late May, sitting on the porch in the early evening warmth with a mending basket that she was not actually mending from, turning the question over in her mind with the honest directness, she tried to apply to her own circumstances. She was staying because of Tobias McCrae. That was the fact of it. She was staying because of the way he looked at her, and the way he listened, and the specific feeling that happened in her chest when she heard the particular sound of his wagon coming up the Caldwell Main Street on a Tuesday or Thursday morning. She was staying because the idea of getting on the stage and going back to St. Louis felt, when she examined it carefully, like choosing to live in a smaller version of the world than she now knew was possible. She was in love with him. She turned that over as well, the way you turn something bright over in the light to see it properly. She was in love with Tobias McCrae, who had carried her 3 miles across a flooded prairie and asked nothing in return but her name. The difficulty was that she did not know with any certainty whether Tobias McCrae was in love with her, because he was a man who kept his feelings behind a reserve that was not coldness, exactly, but was very effective containment. He was kind to her, attentive to her, clearly sought her company, and there were moments, just moments, when she caught something in his expression that made her heart accelerate. But he had not said anything that could be interpreted as a declaration, and he was not the kind of man to press, and she was beginning to wonder whether the thing she felt was mutual or whether she had, in the loneliness of her situation, constructed a feeling out of gratitude and proximity that was real in her but not in him. On a Saturday in late May, Tobias arrived at Mrs. Heller's unexpectedly. It was not a Tuesday or Thursday. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he arrived on horseback rather than by wagon, which meant he had not come into town on ranch business and detoured to see her, but had ridden specifically to Caldwell, specifically to Mrs. Heller's, for no evident reason but this. He sat on the porch with her in the afternoon heat, and they talked for a while about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that circles around something without landing on it, and she let it circle because she was not sure she wanted it to land, because she was not sure what would happen when it did. Then he stopped talking mid-sentence in a way that was completely unlike him, and she looked at him and found him looking at her with an expression that had dropped the careful reserve entirely. "Effie," he said, just that. Just her name, the first time he had used it without the miss in front, and it landed differently than any use of her name had ever landed in her life, like something settling into the right slot. "Yes," she said. "The stage for St. Louis runs on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said. "You have not taken it." "No," she said, "I haven't." "I would like to know," he said, in the careful, deliberate way he had of saying important things, "whether you are staying because you have no better option or whether you are staying for some other reason." He paused. "I am asking because it changes what I'm able to say." Effie looked at him for a long moment. This serious, steady man with his dark eyes and his weathered hands and his hard-won quality of being exactly what he appeared to be. No performance, no facade, just Tobias McCrae, who had carried her across 3 miles of flooded prairie, and who had been showing up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and now on Saturdays because he could not seem to stop himself from coming back. "I am staying," she said, "because every time I think about leaving, the world seems to get smaller and grayer, and every time I think about staying it seems like it gets considerably larger and considerably more interesting." She met his eyes. "I am staying for the second reason." The thing that happened in his expression then was not subtle. It was the thing she had been catching glimpses of for weeks, suddenly undisguised, unconstrained, and it was so plainly and fully directed at her that she felt the warmth of it like stepping out of shade into sun. "I don't have much to offer," he said, in the honest, forward way he had. "I have wages and savings and 2 years of work ahead of me before I can file on a quarter section. I have a horse and a good saddle and a cot in the bunkhouse of the Harlan Ranch. I can't give you what you're used to." "Mr. McCrae," she said, "what I was used to was living in a city where I was invisible and moving toward a future I couldn't see. I don't need what I'm used to." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he did something she did not expect. He reached out and took her hand very gently, with the same care he had applied to carrying her across the flooded hollow, deliberate and certain and unhurried, and held it. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission." "You have it," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, completely. He smiled then. It was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face. The careful reserve lowered entirely, and it transformed him in a way that made something in her chest turn over and stay turned over. It was a good smile, unguarded and warm, the smile of someone who does not offer that kind of openness easily and is choosing to offer it now to her. "Good," he said, and kept holding her hand in the late afternoon light while the Kansas wind moved through the grass, and the town of Caldwell went about its Saturday business around them. Courtship in Caldwell in 1882 was a specific and somewhat circumscribed institution, governed by the practical circumstances of frontier life and the particular moral geography of a cattle town that was trying very hard to grow into something more permanent and respectable than its origins, as a drover's waypoint had suggested. It was not the drawing-room courtship of St. Louis, with calling cards and formal visits and the careful choreography of parlor conversation under the watchful eyes of mothers and aunts. Tobias came to Caldwell when the work of the Harlan Ranch allowed, which was more often than she had initially expected, because he arranged it more carefully than she realized, trading shifts and rearranging tasks with the systematic efficiency he brought to everything, in order to have the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and the occasional Saturday. And when he came, they walked and talked and sat on the porch in the evenings, and sometimes drove out in the wagon to the higher ground south of town, where you could see the prairie in all its enormous flatness, stretching away under the sky until it met the horizon in a line so clean it looked drawn. He brought her things sometimes. Not flowers, which were not easy to come by on a cattle ranch, but things that were themselves specific and thoughtful. A book he had found in a second-hand store in the neighboring town of Wellington, a collection of natural history essays about the Great Plains that he thought she would find interesting, and she did. A piece of rose quartz from a creek bed he had ridden past that he thought was beautiful in the specific way prairie things are beautiful. A letter once, written in the evenings over several days in his careful, unshowy handwriting, telling her things he had been thinking about and had not said aloud, which she read 3 times and kept folded in the pages of the natural history book. She, in turn, made things easier for him than he was accustomed to having things made. She was not a woman who needed to be managed or protected from the reality of what their lives would be, and he understood that quickly and relaxed into it in a way she found deeply gratifying. He talked to her about the ranch work with the same directness he would have applied to another cowhand, not talking down or simplifying, and she asked real questions and offered real observations, and he listened to them with a seriousness that made her feel always that she was a person whose mind he respected, which was not something she had always been able to count on. She found work in Caldwell to keep herself occupied and solvent while the courtship developed, taking on the role of assistant to the town's only schoolteacher, a harried young man named Fletcher who was trying to educate 20 children of varying ages in a single room and was exceedingly grateful for the help. She proved to be good at it, finding in the work a use for the precise, organized intelligence that had not had many other outlets in her life. And the children, after the initial period of testing that children always apply to new authority figures, warmed to her with the particular directness of frontier children who have not yet learned to be guarded. She had not meant to make a life in Caldwell. She had arrived as a stop on the way to somewhere else, and she had stayed for a man she had known less than 3 weeks, and some rational part of her brain occasionally surfaced to point out that this was not a very systematic way to make decisions. But she had been systematic in St. Louis, and systematic had led her to Gerald Foss's sagging farmhouse and his watery eyes and the careful slow death of some essential part of herself. Caldwell was not systematic. Caldwell was a flat-earthed, wind-scoured, sky-dominated outpost of American civilization in the process of becoming itself, and Tobias McCrae was a man who had come to it with $40 and a good horse, and was building something real 1 year at a time. And she found, when she was honest about it, that she wanted to be part of that building. The summer was long and hot, the Kansas heat a different creature entirely from the humid warmth of Missouri, dry and unrelenting and somehow clarifying. Effie's skin, which had been the indoor skin of a city woman, browned slightly in spite of her bonnet, and she stopped minding. The prairie, which had terrified her that first night of rain, revealed itself to her slowly over the months, showing her its specific grammar of grass and wind and distance, the way the light changed at every hour of the day, the exact sound of cicadas in the heat of August afternoons, the remarkable violence and beauty of the thunderstorms that rolled through every few weeks, lit up from within like something alive. She wrote letters to St. Louis to the 2 or 3 friends who were actually friends rather than acquaintances, and she tried to explain what the prairie looked like and how it felt and what she was doing out here. And she found that words were only partially adequate, that the full reality of the place resisted translation into the terms of the life she had left. In July, Tobias took her to a dance in Caldwell, the 4th of July celebration that the town threw every year with a determination that something festive would happen whether the universe cooperated or not. It was held in the largest of the town's buildings, the grain warehouse, which had been swept out and draped with red, white, and blue bunting, and there was a fiddle player and a caller and about 40 people crammed into a space designed for 40 tons of wheat, and it was loud and hot and completely wonderful. Tobias McCrae, it turned out, could dance. She had not expected that. He could dance with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, nothing showy, nothing that drew attention to itself, just the genuine physical confidence of a man comfortable in his body, guiding her through the patterns of a Virginia reel with a sure, steady hand at her back. She discovered, dancing with him, that there was something about being physically close to him in a context other than emergency that was a different experience than she had anticipated, a warmth and ease and the specific pleasure of being in the presence of someone she trusted entirely. He walked her back to Mrs. Heller's in the warm July dark, the fiddle still faintly audible behind them, and at the porch steps he stopped, and she stopped too. He held her hand, the one he had been holding as they left the dance, and he looked at her in the lamplight that came through Mrs. Heller's front window, and he said, "I know I told you 2 years. You did," she said. "I may have been somewhat conservative in my estimate," he said. "The cattle drive pay came in better than I calculated, and old Morrison, who has the quarter section east of the Harlan Range, is selling. He's going back to Ohio." He paused. "I spoke to him last week." Effie looked at him in the lamplight. "You spoke to him last week," she repeated carefully. "About the price," Tobias said, "which is manageable with what I have if I'm not operating alone." He stopped again. This man who was not afraid of difficult physical work or flooded prairies or ornery steers, and he seemed to be finding the next part harder than any of those things. "I'm not a man who has a great deal of practice at saying what he feels, Effie. I expect you've noticed." "I have noticed," she said gently. "But I want to say it plainly," he said. "I love you. I have loved you since you told me you had walked 12 miles across the dark prairie and thought the stars were quite nice. And I would like to spend the rest of my life with you on that quarter section east of the Harlan Range, if you'll have me." He held her gaze with that level, steady directness. "I am asking you to marry me." The July night was warm around them, and the fiddle drifted faintly from the direction of the grain warehouse, and the stars over Kansas were, as she had once noted, quite clear. Effie Crawford stood on Mrs. Heller's porch steps and looked at Tobias McCrae and thought about St. Louis and Gerald Foss, and the morning she had stepped off the stage into this enormous flat wind-scoured world, and how none of it, not one step of it, had led her where she had expected. "Yes," she said, in the same tone she had used that first afternoon on his horse's back, in the same tone she used when she meant something completely. "Yes, Tobias, I'll have you." He kissed her then for the first time, carefully and with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and it was somehow both exactly what she had imagined and entirely different, warmer and more real and more present than any imagined thing can be. Mrs. Heller, who had been watching from behind the curtain of the front window, smiled to herself and went to bed satisfied. They married in September of 1882 in the small Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a modest building that aspired to something grander than its current dimensions, but had good light in the afternoons, which was when they chose to hold the ceremony. The minister was a patient man named Reverend Abbott who had seen many frontier weddings and understood that they were rarely the elaborate productions possible in eastern cities and were not lesser for that. Effie wore a dress she had made herself over the course of August, a deep blue wool that was practical enough for the life ahead and fine enough for a wedding, trimmed with the cream lace she had brought from St. Louis in a piece of tissue paper at the very bottom of her trunk, the one piece of her mother's sewing things she had kept. Tobias wore his good dark suit that he had owned for 5 years and rarely had occasion to wear, and he looked, she thought, exactly like himself in it, which was the best thing she could say about how any person looked in any piece of clothing. He held her hands through the vows and looked at her with that direct, steady gaze, and when he said the words he said them the way he said everything important, carefully, and with the full weight of his intention behind each one. She said hers back to him in the same way, looking at him without looking away, meaning every syllable. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, the small congregation of friends and acquaintances that 4 months of Caldwell life had accumulated. Mrs. Heller in the front row with her good hat on, young Fletcher the schoolteacher looking somewhat emotional in the third pew, several of the Harlan Ranch hands who had cleaned up for the occasion with varying degrees of success, and old Morrison himself, who had sold them the quarter section, and seemed pleased with the transaction in a general human way. After the ceremony, they had a wedding supper at Mrs. Heller's, which she had insisted on providing as her wedding gift, a spread of food that represented considerable effort and was consumed with the sincere appreciation of people who know what effort costs. That night they drove out to the Morrison property in the wagon, their property now, in the warm September dark under a sky crowded with stars. The house on the property was a sod house, which was what most homesteaders built on the Kansas plains where timber was scarce, and the thick prairie sod cut into solid building blocks that held heat in winter and cool in summer with the determined pragmatism of materials doing what they were best suited to. It was a single main room with a lean-to addition and a beaten earth floor and a window on each of 2 walls, and it smelled like earth and grass and the particular dusty sweetness of an old building that had been lived in by people who worked hard. Effie stood in the middle of it in the lamplight and turned slowly, looking at the walls and the low ceiling and the 2 windows and the old iron stove in the corner that would need work, and Tobias stood at the door and watched her look. "It's not much," he said, which was honest. "No," she agreed, also honestly, "but it's ours." The look he gave her when she said that was the same as the one he had given her on Mrs. Heller's porch when she had said she would marry him, that thing in his expression, fully open and undisguised, directed entirely at her. The autumn was the work of making the place livable, which turned out to be considerably more labor-intensive than either of them had entirely anticipated, though neither of them was what you could call surprised by this. The stove required a new flue pipe and considerable cleaning. The roof of the linta had developed a slow leak that needed patching before the winter rain set in. The barn was in better shape than the house, which said something about the Morrisons' priorities, and Tobias's horse was content with it. They worked together, side by side, with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people whose skills complemented each other without either one needing to perform. He was stronger and knew the land and the specific practical demands of frontier construction. She was organized and precise, and could solve problems of domestic engineering with the same methodical intelligence she had once applied to the dry goods inventory in her father's store. They argued sometimes about the right way to do a thing, and neither of them was easily convinced by anything less than a good argument, which meant their disagreements were energetic and specific and generally concluded with one of them conceding that the other had actually been right, or occasionally with a solution that was neither person's original position and was better than both. She learned from him. She learned about the cattle, about reading weather and reading land, about the specific knowledge of the prairie that was not a single large thing, but 10,000 small observations accumulated over years. She learned to ride properly, which she had done badly in a genteel scent. Louis Way and now did well in a Kansas way, sitting deep in the saddle and reading her horse and covering ground with purpose. He rode beside her on the first good cold morning of October when she went out at a confident canter for the first time, and he said nothing at all, just watched her with that quiet expression that she had come to read as its own kind of eloquence. He learned from her. He learned that a house that is also a home has different requirements than a bunkhouse, which he understood in principle, but not entirely in practice. He learned, with what she later described as admirable speed and grace, that her opinion was not optional input but actual data that improved the outcome of decisions. He learned that she did not need to be shielded from difficulty, but she did need to be included in what was difficult, and that these were very different things that felt, initially, counterintuitive to a man who had been managing his own difficulties alone for years. November brought the first real cold, the hard cold of the Kansas winter that came down from the north without apology and settled into the earth and stayed there. They had prepared for it as well as they could, with wood for the stove and preserved food, and the additional insulation they had packed into the sod walls in October. The soddy was warmer than it looked, the thick earth walls holding the stove's heat with a patience that surprised Effie, who had expected to be miserable, and was instead merely cold in the mornings before the fire built up. There were long winter evenings that were their own kind of gift. They sat by the stove in the lamplight, Effie reading or sewing, Tobias working on the harness or going over the accounts of what they had spent and what they needed and what the spring might bring. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they were simply quiet together, and both were good. He told her more of Tennessee on those evenings. He had left it at 19 without much looking back, with the forward-facing urgency of a young man with no particular prospects in the place he was born, but it was still there in him, the green hills and the particular people of it, his mother who had died the year after he left, and whom he still thought about with a quiet grief he did not often speak, his younger brother Caleb who had stayed and married and had children Tobias had not met. Effie listened to all of it with the same attention he gave her stories, and she suggested that winter that he write to Caleb, which he had not done in over a year. He wrote. Caleb wrote back. The correspondence was brief and somewhat awkward at first, as correspondence between brothers who have been separated by years and miles tends to be. But by spring it had found a rhythm, and there was talk of Caleb and his wife possibly coming west the following year to see the new situation. Spring came back to the prairie in April of 1883 with the same dramatic energy it had arrived with the previous year, thunderstorms and flooding, and the explosive green of new grass across the flat land. And Effie found herself watching the first big rain of the season from the window of their soddy with something almost like affection. Tobias came up behind her and looked out over her shoulder at the flooding prairie. Thinking of going for a walk, he said. Not this time, she said, and she could feel him smile without looking. In April, she also told him something she had been certain of for about 3 weeks, with the particular mixture of joy and terror that is the specific province of that kind of news. She told him quietly, in the morning, over coffee, watching his face. His face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, which she had expected, something that moved under that, deep and serious. And then the same thing that had been in his expression on the porch and at the wedding and in 100 smaller moments since, that fully open, undisguised thing, now larger than it had been in any of those moments, large enough to fill the whole of his face. He put his coffee cup down with great care and came around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that she thought she might carry in her memory to the very end of her life. "Are you well?" He asked first, which was the first question, the right first question, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. "That's the main thing." And then the smile came, slow and enormous, the best smile she had ever seen him produce. And she was laughing before she quite knew she was going to, and he was pulling her into his arms, and she was laughing into his shoulder, and he was holding her the way he had held her on the flooded prairie, certain and complete. He was gentle with her that spring and summer in a way that she had to work to keep from becoming overprotective, because she was perfectly capable of doing most of what she had always done, and told him so with some regularity. He accepted this better than she had initially feared, calibrating his concern to something she could actually stand, though she caught him watching her sometimes with a kind of careful attention that was its own form of love, quiet and constant, and not intrusive. The summer of 1883 was hot and dry in the particular way that Kansas summers sometimes are, without the redemptive violence of storms, just steady, relentless heat that baked the prairie to a pale gold, and made the work of the day best done in the mornings and evenings, with a long midday retreat to the shade. Their quarter section was doing well by the standards of new homesteads, with a kitchen garden that Effie had expanded in the spring now producing abundantly, a small flock of chickens that had established a territorial claim to the south side of the barn, and the cattle operation that Tobias was building with the careful patience he brought to everything. 6 head of cattle now where there had been 2 in November. Old Red the stove had been replaced by a newer model bought on credit from the hardware store in Caldwell, a better beast that held temperature more reliably, and the soddy had acquired curtains at the windows and a braided rug on the beaten earth floor, and the particular personalized character of a house that has been lived in and thought about by people who intend to stay. The baby came in November of 1883, a boy, arriving with the fierce and focused urgency of someone who has been waiting long enough and is done waiting. Mrs. Heller came out from Caldwell to assist, because she had assisted at more frontier births than she could easily count, and because she would have come regardless of any practical justification. The midwife, a capable and matter-of-fact woman named Mrs. Draper, who had delivered perhaps 40 children in the surrounding county, managed the proceedings with calm authority. Tobias stayed close enough that she could hear him on the other side of the door in the moments when the labor was hardest, and she found, in some part of her that existed beneath the immediate demands of what her body was doing, that knowing he was there was worth something real and specific. The boy arrived at 3 in the morning, furious and loud and already determined, and Tobias came in when Mrs. Heller called him, and he held his son for the first time with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything precious, looking down at the small red face with an expression that had no name Effie could put to it, something large and new and overwhelming, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he did not have words for. "Hello," he said to the baby in his quiet, steady voice. "I'm your father." They named him James, for Tobias's father, who had died when Tobias was 12, a man Tobias spoke of rarely but with a specific, deep respect that told her more than many words would have. James Crawford McCrae, carrying both names, which seemed right. James was a good baby in the specific sense that he was extremely clear about what he wanted at any given moment and expected those around him to figure it out with some urgency. He was not particularly interested in sleeping at the hours his parents would have preferred. He had opinions about the temperature and the quality of the lamplight and the general level of competence demonstrated by the adults in his vicinity, and he expressed these opinions with confidence and volume. Tobias was a revelation with him. Effie had not predicted the specific quality of his fatherhood, though she supposed she might have, because it was entirely consistent with who he was. He was patient with the baby in the same deep structural way he was patient with everything. Not the brittle patience of someone trying very hard not to lose their composure, but the genuine patience of someone for whom waiting and observing and responding appropriately was simply how you operated in the world. He learned what James needed as he had learned everything about the prairie, by paying attention, by being present, by taking the specific reality of the situation seriously rather than imposing his expectations on it. In the mornings, he would take the baby so Effie could sleep another hour, which was a gift of the first order, and she would wake to the sound of his voice from the main room, talking to James in the low, quiet tone he used when he was explaining something, matter of fact and thoughtful, as if the baby were going to have useful input. She lay listening on those mornings and felt something she did not have precise words for, a fullness, an extraordinary rightness, a sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be in the world at exactly the time she was supposed to be there, which was not something she had felt often before she came to Kansas and had thought, in her harder moments, innocent. Louis, she might never feel. Caleb McCrae and his wife Clara came west in the spring of 1884, as they had been discussing in the letters all winter. They arrived on the stage from Wichita, Clara with a baby of their own on her hip and Caleb with Tobias's dark eyes in a face that was organized somewhat differently, a version of the McCrae look that had taken a different direction than the original. The brothers looked at each other on the Caldwell stage platform for a moment, after 5 years of separation, and then shook hands with the particular formality of men who feel too much to show it easily. And then Caleb said something low and Tobias said something back and they both laughed, and the formality dissolved. Effie liked Clara immediately, the clear-eyed, practical warmth of a woman who had also chosen frontier life with open knowledge of what it entailed and was getting on with it without complaint. They sat at the table in the soddy the first evening, and talked as if they had been acquainted for years, the baby boys investigating each other with solemn mutual regard, while the men took a walk around the property, and did the kind of catching up that men sometimes need to do in motion rather than at rest. Caleb and Clara were looking at land to the east, thinking of filing their own claim, drawn west by the combination of the letters, and the homestead act's promise of a future of their own on their own ground. Tobias spent 2 days showing Caleb the land and the water sources and the general character of the country, with the generosity of someone who knows the value of having your family within reasonable distance in a hard country. They stayed 2 weeks and left with a warmth between the two families that felt, to Effie, like something being repaired that had been broken by circumstance and was now being mended piece by piece through intention and effort. They did file on land east of the Harlan Range and were neighbors in the Kansas way of the word, which meant within an hour's ride rather than within a street's walk, and that was enough. The years on the prairie were not without their difficulties, because nothing real ever is. There was a drought the summer of 1885 that was serious enough to reduce the kitchen garden and stress the cattle and require careful management of what they had. Tobias made the decisions about the cattle with the same methodical calm he brought to everything, selling 2 head before the worst of it rather than after, holding the others through on reduced water with a discipline that was exhausting in its vigilance. Effie kept the garden alive on buckets of water she hauled from the creek a 1/4 mile away, which was its own labor, and preserved everything she could with the focused intensity of someone who has calculated what they need to get through a hard winter and is making sure they get there. They talked about everything, as they always did, laying the difficulties out plainly between them and looking at them, and deciding together what to do about them. There was never a version of their marriage in which Tobias made decisions while Effie received them, because she would not have tolerated that and he would not have wanted it. They were partners in the genuine sense, two people with different skills and the same stake in the outcome. The drought broke in September with 3 days of good solid rain that fell without the drama of the spring floods, just steady and soaking, and deeply welcome. The creek came up and the grass greened again at the roots, and the cattle stopped looking at Tobias with the resigned patience of animals that have been through worse and are prepared to be patient but would prefer not to be. Effie stood in the kitchen garden in the September rain with her face turned up, eyes closed, and felt the water on her skin and thought about that first night at Mrs. Heller's when she had listened to the rain and thought it was God telling her she had made a terrible mistake. She had not made a mistake. She had made the best decision of her life, which was not the one she had planned, which was how the best decisions often went. The schoolteacher young Fletcher left Caldwell in 1885, having been offered a better position in Wichita, and the school board, which consisted of 4 serious men in good coats, came to Effie and asked if she would consider taking the position. She considered it for 2 days, discussed it with Tobias in the thorough way they discussed things, and accepted. Teaching the Caldwell School was the most exhausting and the most satisfying work she had done since coming to Kansas, and given that she had been making a homestead in the Kansas Prairie for 3 years, that was saying something. There were 22 children of 9 different nationalities in the single room now, children of German and Swedish and Irish and American-born settlers, several of them, the children of the freedmen who had been making their way west since the end of the war, and navigating the social and educational complexity of that room required everything she had. She saw the injustices clearly. The children of the freedmen families came to school with fewer books and worse clothing, and the particular wariness of children who have been taught by their parents' experience that the world does not distribute its benefits equally. She did not pretend the injustice was not there, as some of the other adults in Caldwell were inclined to do, with the comfortable oblivion of people who are not affected by what they choose not to see. She insisted, quietly and consistently, on the same quality of attention and opportunity for every child in her classroom, and she gave extra time to the children who needed it without making it a conspicuous charity that would embarrass them. Tobias understood this about her and supported it without qualification, which was one of the things about him she loved most specifically. He was a fair man in the deep structural sense, fair the way the land was fair, indifferent to the irrelevant and responsive to the actual. He judged people by what they did and what they were, and he extended that principle to his business dealings and his neighborly relations with the equity of someone who has thought about what fairness actually requires and chosen to practice it. Their second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl this time, with Effie's brown eyes and Tobias's jaw, and the immediate forceful personality of someone who intends to have opinions about everything and does not plan to wait until she can talk to express them. They named her Rosalind, after a character in a Shakespeare play that Effie loved and Tobias had read the previous winter specifically because she loved it. Rosalind McCrae arrived in April with the spring grass and settled into the family with the assurance of someone who knows exactly where she belongs. James, who was 2 years old and deeply interested in everything, regarded his new sister with the solemn, investigatory attention of a scientist examining a new specimen, and then gave his provisional verdict by patting her head with one careful hand, which was taken as approval by the general consensus of those present. The soddy had become too small for 4 people, which was a challenge they had been aware was coming, and had been preparing for with the methodical foresight they brought to everything. Tobias had been cutting lumber and acquiring materials for 2 years, and in the summer of 1886 they began building, with the help of Caleb and several neighbors, the real house, the timber-framed house with 3 rooms and a proper wooden floor and a front porch that faced west toward the enormous Kansas sunsets. The house raising was a community event in the frontier way, neighbors coming from distances that would have seemed prohibitive in a city. Because in this country, the distances between people meant that when someone needed help you came, because you had needed help yourself and would need it again. And the only thing that made the distances survivable was the mutual understanding that nobody survived them alone. They built the frame in 2 days and the roof in 1 more, 20 people working with the combined purposefulness of people who know what they are doing and why they are doing it. Mrs. Heller drove out from Caldwell and organized the food, which was its own massive logistical operation, feeding 20 hungry people across 3 days. Caleb and Clara worked alongside Tobias and Effie, and their children underfoot in the way of children at work sites, contributing enthusiasm and occasional minor chaos. Moving into the finished house, even before it was entirely complete, even with the smell of new wood and sawdust still sharp in the air, and 2 rooms still needing their finishing work, was the particular joy of people who have earned what they have arrived at. Effie stood in the main room with its wooden floor and its real plaster walls and its large window facing west, and she thought about Mrs. Heller's boarding house and the small room with the east-facing window and the sound of the rain. And she thought about all the distance, literal and otherwise, that lay between that moment and this one. Tobias came and stood beside her, James on his hip and Rosalind in the crook of his other arm, and looked out the west-facing window with her at the flat gold prairie and the enormous sky. "Good," he said, which was the word he used when he meant something more than he was going to say. "Yes," she said, "very good." The years that followed had the quality of real life lived in full, which is different from stories in that it contains proportions of ordinary days that stories rarely have the patience for. The particular texture of years filled with work and weather, and the growth of children, and the steady deepening of a relationship between 2 people who have chosen each other, and keep choosing each other through the daily evidence of what that means. James grew from a serious-faced toddler into a serious-faced boy who had Tobias's deliberateness and Effie's precision, and an additional something that was entirely his own, a gift for the natural world that went beyond the practical rancher's knowledge of it, a genuine curiosity about how things worked and why they grew, and what the patterns underneath the visible surface of the prairie actually were. By the time he was 7, he could tell you the names of 40 prairie plants, and the difference between the various types of clouds, and the reason the creek ran higher in the spring than in the fall. And he told you these things not to show off, but because he genuinely thought you would find them as interesting as he did, which was an inheritance from both his parents. Rosalind was an entirely different creature, with the vivid social intelligence and the forceful personality she had announced herself with at birth, interested in people the way James was interested in the natural world, attentive to the dynamics of every room she entered, with an opinion about everything, and the conviction to express it that Effie recognized from her own interior life, and that Tobias regarded with an expression that combined exasperation and enormous pride in roughly equal measure. A 3rd child arrived in 1888, another boy they named William, a quiet and deliberate child from his earliest days who watched the world with a patience that seemed remarkable in someone so young, and who attached himself to Tobias with the specific devotion of a child who has identified the person whose qualities he most wants to understand. Effie kept the school through these years, with the particular satisfaction of work that matters and the specific exhaustion of work that takes everything you have. She watched children learn to read and to calculate and to understand the world in larger terms than the single section of prairie their families occupied, and she thought about what it meant to give someone that, the larger world inside language and number and history, and she thought it was worth every bit of the effort. Caldwell grew. The cattle trade that had made the town its early rough character had moderated as the railroads pushed further into the cattle country, and the drives from Texas became shorter, and the town that was filling in behind the drovers was a different kind of place, more permanent and more varied, with a proper library by 1887 and a second church, and a doctor who had come from Ohio, and was thoroughly surprised by the quantity of work available to him. The Harlan Ranch, where Tobias had worked those first 4 years, changed hands in 1889 when old Joseph Harlan died, and his son, who had never liked the frontier and had been waiting out his father's obstinate attachment to it, sold up and went back to Cincinnati. The new owner was a land company from Chicago that managed the range through a foreman, and the personal quality that had made the Harlan operation what it was evaporated in the way things evaporate when they are no longer tended by the person whose will created them. This had indirect but real consequences for Tobias, whose relationship with the Harlan operation had continued in various supply and grazing arrangements since he left to work his own quarter section. He spent a winter working through the new numbers with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, and concluded that independence was actually better than it had been before, that the arrangements with the land company were cleaner and less personal, and in their very impersonality more predictable. In 1890, they had a particularly good year with the cattle, and Tobias filed on the adjacent quarter section that had come available, doubling their land and requiring a corresponding expansion of everything else: another animal, more fencing, the additional pasture management that more land demanded. Effie did the accounts for the operation now, having taken that over in the second year of their marriage when it had become clear that her facility with numbers was considerably greater than his, and he had conceded this without a single trace of ego, simply moved to the arrangement that produced better results, which was entirely characteristic. She sat at the desk in the west-facing room of their 3-room house on an October evening in 1890 and went through the numbers for the year with a satisfaction that was not smug but was deeply real, the satisfaction of having built something that works. James was 7 and asleep. Rosalind was 4 and asleep after a period of protest. William was 2 and finally asleep. Tobias was sitting by the stove with a bridle he was repairing, working the leather with the patient, even strokes she had been watching for 8 years. She looked at him across the room, this man who had carried her across a flooded prairie on a May afternoon in 1882, and asked nothing in return but her name, and she thought about what it would be like to have missed him, to have been in the boarding house when the rain came rather than out on the prairie where she ought not to have been, to have gotten back on the stage that Thursday and gone back to St. Louis, and the small gray version of the future that waited there. She could not picture it. The future that existed without him had no texture, no weight. She could not make it real in her imagination in the way the actual present was real, the warm room and the stove and the sleeping children and this man who was exactly who he had always been and who looked up from the bridle and caught her looking and gave her the quiet, undisguised look that she had loved from the beginning. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking. About the numbers." "About Thursday," she said. "In May of 1882, the Thursday I didn't take the stage." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Best decision you ever made," he said. "I think so," she said, "although the flooded prairie part could have gone differently." "I was glad you went out there," he said, with the directness he brought to things he had thought about and knew to be true. "You were glad I got stuck in 2 feet of mud," she said. "I was glad I found you," he said simply, and went back to the bridle. She turned back to the numbers and felt, in the warm room with the stove crackling and the children sleeping and the Kansas night enormous and dark and full of stars outside the west-facing window, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the path to here had been sensible or planned, but because it had been hers, every step of it, her mistake and her stubbornness and her refusal to be sensible, and his horse and his steady voice and his arms, and the specific miracle of his being on that flooded prairie at that specific moment. In 1891, James started at the school where his mother taught, which was an arrangement that held certain complications and certain pleasures. The complications were the ones you would expect, the awkwardness of a child whose mother is his teacher, the difficulty of treating each other in school the way their roles demanded when home was a different thing. The pleasures were quieter and less dramatic but real, watching her son in the classroom from the teacher's vantage, seeing how his mind worked in the specific context of formal learning, seeing him help the younger children with the same patient, matter-of-fact generosity that was a recognizable quality in his father. Rosalind could not wait to go to school. She had been asking since the age of 3 when she could go, and when she finally started in 1893, she arrived on her first day with the confidence of someone who has been preparing for an event and is ready for it. Effie managed the particular challenge of teaching her own daughter with the same honest commitment to fairness she brought to everything, which meant that Rosalind got no special treatment in either direction and was sometimes aggrieved about this, though she got over it. William started in 1895, the last of the 3, a quiet, steady student who worked through things with a persistence that was very recognizable to anyone who knew his father. Not flashy or fast, but thorough and reliable, and ultimately more effective for both qualities. Mrs. Heller died in the spring of 1893, peacefully and in her own house, at the age of 71. Effie went into Caldwell to help with the arrangements with the weight of genuine grief, because Mrs. Heller had been the first kind thing in Caldwell and the first person who had looked at her situation and helped without asking for anything in return beyond basic human decency, and that kind of person leaves a real absence. The boarding house passed to Mrs. Heller's niece, a practical young woman from Lawrence who kept it running in approximately the same way, which would have satisfied Mrs. Heller's standards. Caleb and Clara were doing well on their east section, 3 children of their own now, the 2 families close in the Kansas way that distance and common experience create, sharing work and resources and the ordinary texture of neighboring lives. Caleb came over 2 or 3 times a month, and Clara and Effie had an easy friendship built on the specific solidarity of 2 women who had each chosen something difficult with open eyes and were getting on with it without self-pity or regret. The century turned. 1900 arrived without particular ceremony on the McCrae homestead, because the date changed in the middle of winter, and winter on the Kansas prairie did not take much notice of symbolic human milestones. Tobias was 44, and Effie was 41, and James was 16, and Rosalind was 14, and William was 12. And the house they lived in had been added to twice since it was built in 1886, with a proper parlor now and 4 bedrooms and a summer kitchen off the back that made the hot months considerably more manageable. On the first morning of 1900, Effie stood on the west-facing porch in the cold January air and looked at the prairie and thought about 1882, about being 23 years old and arriving in Kansas with a trunk and a letter and no very clear vision of what came next. 18 years. The same prairie, the same enormous sky, the same wind coming down from the north, and everything else entirely different. Tobias came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee and gave her one, and they stood together in the cold morning quiet looking at the first dawn of a new century over the Kansas plains. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Tennessee." He thought about it, which he always did genuinely before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "the green of it, but I've been here longer than I was there." He looked at the prairie. "This is home." "Yes," she said, "it is." James was 17 in 1901, and already as good a rancher as his father, with the additional dimension of that natural science curiosity that had been his particular characteristic from childhood, which he had been channeling into the increasingly scientific approach to land management that some of the more forward-thinking ranchers in Kansas were beginning to explore. He read everything he could find on the subject, writing to agricultural colleges for their pamphlets, discussing what he read with his father in the evenings with the specific earnest intensity of a young man who has found the intersection of what he loves and what he is good at. Tobias listened to all of it with the attention he gave everything, and he implemented what James argued for when James argued for it well, which was most of the time. There was something in watching the two of them work together, father and son at the table or in the field, that carried in Effie's chest a weight of gratitude she could not always articulate. Rosalind, at 15, had decided she wanted to be a teacher, which surprised nobody who had paid any attention to her over the previous decade. She had her mother's intelligence and her own particular social gift, the ability to understand what a person needed and respond to it, which was the essential skill of teaching that no amount of formal training could fully replace if it was absent, and no amount of its absence mattered when it was present. William was the quietest of the three, and the one who sometimes worried Effie in the way quiet children worry you, because their interior life is less available. But she watched him and she knew him, and what she saw was not trouble or unhappiness, but a genuine contentment with being exactly who he was, a boy who liked the cattle and the land and the specific daily work of the homestead, and was not planning to be anything other than what he was, which was more than enough. In the spring of 1902, Tobias came in from the range one afternoon and sat at the table in the way he sat when he had something to say and was working up to saying it. She recognized this. She had been recognizing it for 20 years, and she had learned that the best thing was to make the coffee and wait, which she did. "There's a chance," he said, when the coffee was poured and he had organized his thoughts the way he organized the cattle, each one in its right place, to expand the operation. "Harlan's east section has come available. The land company is selling off parcels." "How much?" she asked, meaning how much land and also how much money. He told her both. She thought about it for a moment, running the numbers in the way she always ran numbers, automatic and clear. "It's manageable," she said. "If the cattle prices hold through the fall." "They should," he said. "Then we should do it," she said. He looked at her with the same expression he had been giving her for 20 years when she said the thing he had hoped she would say, direct and warm and full of the specific gratitude of a man who knows what it means to have a partner who is genuinely a partner. "I thought so too," he said. They bought the parcel. The cattle prices held. The operation in 1902 was something that would have been inconceivable to the Tobias McCrae, who had arrived on the Kansas plains with $40 and a good horse, and entirely logical given the 20 years of careful, determined, patient work that had accumulated between that arrival and this. James got married in 1904 to a young woman named Ada Whitmore from Caldwell, the daughter of the hardware store owner, a competent and good-humored young woman who took to the ranching life with the enthusiasm of someone who has always wanted exactly this without quite knowing what to call it. The wedding was at the Caldwell Methodist Church, and Effie sat in the front pew and watched her son say his vows and thought of the afternoon she had stood in front of Reverend Abbott's successor and said her own, and she reached for Tobias's hand without looking at him, and he took it and held it. Ada came to live on the property because the house was large enough, and because the operation needed the hands, and because James wanted nothing more than to be where the land was. And by the end of 1904, there was a small second structure going up on the eastern edge of the property, a house for the young couple, the next generation's version of what the Soddy had been, built better and faster with the accumulated knowledge and resources of 20 years of building. Rosalind was at the State Normal School in Emporia by 1903, getting the teaching credentials she needed, and she graduated in 1905 with the certificate and the specific confidence of someone who has prepared thoroughly for the work they have chosen. She took a position in a school outside Wichita, and the distance was the ordinary Prairie distance, manageable by train now that the railroad had extended its reach. And she was home for the summers and the significant occasions and was entirely herself in Wichita as she was at home, which is all you can ask for any child you raise. William, at 17, was what he had always been heading toward being, a rancher pure and uncomplicated, working alongside James and Tobias with the even-tempered capability of someone who has found the life that suits him and settled into it without drama. He had a particular way with the cattle that was not sentimental, but was genuine, a quality of attention and patience that the animals responded to. And he took on the management of the herd's daily welfare, with the serious commitment of someone who understands that the small daily things are what the large things are made of. Tobias was 50 years old in 1908, and Effie was 49, and the ranch was a real operation by any measure. More than 300 head of cattle on 480 acres of Kansas land, a fine timber house with a porch on the west side, and a summer kitchen, and a root cellar and a proper barn that had replaced the original Morrison structure twice over. The accounts were healthy and the land was good, and the children were their own people in the world, which is what children are supposed to become. On a May evening in 1908, which was May because it was always going to be May, because May was their month in the way some things are a couple's month, the month that holds the thing that started all of it. Tobias sat on the west-facing porch with Effie in the last of the evening light, and the enormous Kansas sky was doing what it did in May, filling up with color, amber and rose, and the particular deep blue that lives at the top of the sky when the sun is at the horizon. And the prairie was spread out before them in the fading light, the same prairie she had nearly drowned in 26 years ago on a foolish walk in the wrong direction. "I was thinking today," Tobias said, in the way he said things he had been thinking about for a while, "about that hollow past the Miller line." "Were you," she said. "Where I found you," he said, "May of 1882. "I know which hollow," she said. "It's filled in," he said. "The drainage from the east field drains through there now. You could walk it on a wet day and not get stuck." "Progress," she said. He was quiet for a moment. On the porch light, she could see the gray in his dark hair and the deepened lines at the corners of his eyes and the way time had settled into his face without diminishing it, the same jaw and the same directness and the same quality of simply being exactly who he was, nothing added and nothing removed. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what would have happened if the rain had come 3 days later." "The stage would have run," she said. "And you would have been on it," he said. "Almost certainly," she said. "I think about that sometimes," he said. She looked at him in the fading evening light. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "The rain came when it came," she said. "And I went where I went, which I shouldn't have. And you were there because the steer was ornery and the creek ran high. Everything had to be exactly what it was. I don't think about what would have happened if it was different." "No," he said after a moment. "You're right." She settled back in her chair and looked at the sunset doing its considerable best across the Kansas horizon. "I thought about you, though," she said. "That first night before I met you. Lying in Mrs. Heller's room listening to the rain, I thought, what is it going to take for my life to become what it should be?" "And," he said. "And then the next day I went for a walk in the wrong direction," she said, "and there you were." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on Mrs. Heller's porch in July of 1882, with the same deliberate certainty, and held it. "Here I am," he said. The stars came out over Kansas the way they always did, without apology or announcement, just suddenly present in the enormous dark sky above the flat land. And the prairie was quiet around them with the specific deep quiet that is only possible in a place where the nearest town is 8 miles away. And the night belongs entirely to the wind and the grass and whatever small creatures are going about their honest nocturnal business. Ada and James came home from the East House in time for supper, James with the particular sunburn of a man who has been outside all day doing physical work, Ada with the pleased efficiency of someone who has had a productive day of her own. They brought news. Another child coming, the second one, their son Thomas already 18 months old, and investigating the porch steps with determined inexperience. The supper table was full that evening, James and Ada and Thomas, William quiet and settled at the end, Effie and Tobias at the head, the food substantial and good, and the conversation moving the way conversation does at a table full of people who know each other well. from the serious to the comic and back without any particular effort. After supper, Tobias read to Thomas in the lamplight, a thing he had done for all three of his children and was doing now for the next generation, the same patient, unperformative reading he had always done, his voice steady and warm in the quiet room. Effie washed the dishes and listened to him, and thought about the first time she had understood who he was, really, in the deeper sense. It had not been on the flooded prairie, though that had shown her something essential about how he moved in the world. It had not been on the porch in July, or in the church in September. It had been in February of their first winter, on a very cold morning when the stove had gone out in the night, and the temperature in the soddy had dropped to something genuinely dangerous, and she had woken to find him already up, already rebuilding the fire with the same careful, deliberate efficiency he brought to everything. And there had been a moment, before he knew she was awake, when she had watched him blowing on the small flame he had coaxed from the cold stove, intent and patient, and she had thought, "This man will never stop trying." And that had been the real knowledge, the deep knowledge, the one that had been the foundation of the 26 years since. He came to the kitchen when Thomas was asleep, and she handed him a cup of coffee, and they stood at the counter for a moment in the lamplight, just the two of them, the house settling around them with the sounds of people moving toward their rest, and he looked at her with the look she had loved for 26 years, direct and warm and fully her. "Good day," he said, meaning the whole of it. "Very good," she said, meaning the same. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, the same stars that had shone on the flooded prairie in May of 1882, on the young stubborn woman walking 12 miles in the dark who thought they were quite nice, on the young determined man riding across flat country with $40 and a good horse and a future he was going to build by hand if that was what it took. The stars did not know what they had witnessed. They were simply stars. But the two people standing in the lamplight in the warm kitchen of a house they had built on land they had earned, with 3 children and 2 grandchildren now in various stages of beginning their own versions of the same long story, they knew. They knew the whole of it, from the flooded hollow to this evening, and the knowing sat between them easy and full and complete, the way it does when you have spent enough of your one life with the right person to understand, in your bones, that you have. Tobias McCrae had carried Effie Crawford 3 miles across a flooded Kansas prairie in May of 1882 and asked nothing in return but her name. She had given him her name. And then, because she was Effie Crawford and she did not do things halfway, she had given him everything else.